So there's this really interesting talk going on right now about whether we should lower the voting age to 16. The argument goes that because teens are affected by policies, they should also have the right to vote for those policies. Personally, I think that that is a terrible idea because, like, think about when you were 16. When I was 16, I had no idea of how difficult it was to work on a budget, nor did I really understand what a budget was. Budgeting for me when I was 16 was trying to figure out how many Yu-Gi-Oh cards I could buy with my $20 monthly allowance. To be honest, like, I didn't even know that the government was working on a budget. Like, I thought like the government had like infinite amounts of money that they just needed to figure things out to do with. So if you asked my 16-year-old self what the liberal government should do to balance its budget, I would have been like, budget? But I swear it wasn't just me that didn't understand the gravity of some political issues. I remember being in this really heated conversation with a friend of mine in high school. I was so frustrated because she thought that the Canadian government was wasting too much money trying to help First Nations communities. Now, I didn't really understand about taxes or any of that kind of stuff when I was 16, but I did know that I had a lot of First Nations friends, and I did know that they were suffering greatly because of all the atrocities that were visited upon their ancestors in residential schools and whatnot. But her idea was that, like, you know, that was a few years ago, people should just get over it. She had never met a First Nations person. Later on, I met her in university, and one of the first things she told me was how embarrassed she was about the opinions she had in the past about First Nations people. The crazy thing is that we were both pretty smart teenagers. We were both like straight A students. We studied hard, and in those studies, we did learn about those issues that I just talked about. Because I did learn about like government and how they use their taxes in grade 10 sociology. And my friend did learn about colonialism in Canada in grade 9 history. Our 16-year-old minds were just unable to connect the things that we were learning in class and the things of reality. And that makes complete sense, because how are you supposed to really understand government budgeting if you've never even done your own personal budgeting or touched a tax form in your life? And it is difficult to understand the real weight of what residential schools were if you've never personally met a First Nations person. So most 16-year-olds, including my past self, not having been exposed to those things, I think it would make it hard for them to make a really informed, responsible voting decision. And by the logic of giving teens the vote because they're affected by policies, does that also mean that pre-teens should get the vote because they're also affected by policies? Because if you think about it, everyone is affected by the policies of government, right? Like, I remember being in elementary school and the federal elections were coming, and just for fun, I would ask them, like, who would you vote for? And I remember them being like, oh, I want to vote green because I really like green, or I want to vote liberal because I really like red. No one said I'm going to vote conservative because I think they're the most fiscally responsible. But I think that the biggest obstacle that young people have when thinking through political issues is how they see different perspectives, or more specifically, how they don't see different perspectives. When I was in church as a 16-year-old, I remember that there was a lot of liberal voters inside of the church back then. Now, I didn't know who the liberals were or what they stood for. I just knew a lot of the people around me at church spoke highly of them and spoke lowly of the Conservative Party. So I naturally thought that conservatives must be the bad guys. And I legitimately thought, like, who in their right minds would vote conservative, right? Like, nobody's voting conservative. But obviously some people were voting conservative because Stephen Harper won. I was so confused because I was like, I thought Canada was filled with good people. Who would vote for these bad guys? All that to say that, like, you know, when I was young, or young people today even, are stuck with inside of their communities, and it's hard for them to see outside of the perspectives that are surrounding them all the time. Of course, I'm thinking about these things now because there's a federal election looming very, very soon. But it's also because in my Bible reading plan, I've recently hit Exodus, and I found something really, really interesting. In Exodus 22, verse 28, in the section of the laws that explain social responsibility, it says, "Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people." And that got me thinking about what it means to curse, or especially what it means to curse your political authorities. And what came to me was how cursing really limits the way that we think about political issues in a nuanced way. When we're dealing with political leaders really flippantly, right, and we just deride them as being stupid or dumb, really what we're doing is we're not focusing on the political issues that they're talking about, but what we're focusing on is our incredulity, our anger. And anger, for anybody who has been angry, it really keeps us from thinking straight sometimes. But not only that, it also affects the people around us from thinking about things clearly. Like, I remember when I was a teen and I was sitting down and I was listening to people older than myself just like deriding these political leaders and whatnot. The things that catch young people's ears, and most people's ears, is not nuanced positions, but strong language, strong emotion, and if we're being honest, controversy. And again, that keeps us from really thinking about politics in a level-headed and effective way so that we can make informed decisions rather than just emotional ones. I know what you're thinking. Like, you're thinking, what if that political leader or that political person is really a moron or really evil? To which I will say, then let's learn from other politically involved Christians. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister who lived during the Third Reich and when Hitler was the Führer. And he calls out evil for what it is. He stayed inside of Germany because of his personal convictions to stand as protest against the things that were happening. And he was jailed for it, and then he was hung for it. He called out evil for what it was, but he didn't resort to name calling in order to get his point across. And then there's also Martin Luther King Jr., who's probably one of the most successful civil rights activists of all time. He was a fiery preacher. Nobody could question his passion, and he suffered for calling out evil for what it was. But in his writing or in his preaching, he never resorted to name calling. He was never flippant about his political enemies. Like these Christian political leaders, we can also be involved politically. We can also be passionate about issues, but we don't need to resort to cursing in order to be effective. What you do by calling somebody a moron is telling them that their position is below your level of intelligence, which somehow makes them unworthy of your respect and common decency. And that sort of judgment should be impossible for a people who follow a religion that believes in the fallenness of all humankind and the grace of God. Because if we believe that all humanity is fallen in sin, then we are all equally condemned, and none of us can stand as righteous above another person. And the only truly righteous judge that can stand above humanity and judge them morally is God, who is perfect. Christians, we have no theological foundation upon which we can stand and belittle other people, which, yes, includes our political leaders. I know that's a hard teaching because of the outrageous things that political leaders sometimes do. Sometimes they do things that make me feel like they deserve cursing. It makes me want to complain, actually. Like, the biblical people didn't have anyone as ridiculous as Justin Trudeau or ridiculous as Trump. But you know what they did have was Nero. The guy that would eventually burn Rome down and blame it on the Christians. Yet in spite of all that, it didn't stop Paul from writing to the Roman Christians to respect their authorities. Again, you can critique evil for what it is, but the point is to maintain a posture of Christian reverence while doing it. Thinking through issues and positions with a critical mind and using language and a tone of voice that reflects that thoughtful approach. And Christians should be thoughtful about politics, might I add. The passage that Paul wrote about respecting authorities in Romans 13 that I referenced, it says that government was established to do the right, to be just. And the thing about democracy is that in its ideal, at its best, we are the government. By the vote, we govern ourselves through the people that we choose as representatives. So if you feel like the government has responsibilities that it should take seriously, like protecting justice, then take your responsibility of governance seriously and go out there and vote. And if you don't vote because you're too lazy, then laziness is what you can expect from your government. Anyways, that's gonna do it for today. So grace, peace, and happy voting, and see you in the next one.